It's a 20-week course. At Birkbeck, it's a 10-week course. For you, it's a 45-unit course. So I don't know how I'm going to get to this material, but we're going to give it a try. This is really a lecture called Biology of Evil, which is about a lost rhetoric of degeneration. But I don't want you to think this is just a history lesson, because I think it's really important in telling us a bit about who we are and who we might be. And that's why I start off with this wonderful quotation from Borges. Universal history, perhaps the history of the different intonations given to a handful of metaphors. So I'm going to be talking about sort of metaphoric of evil that I think still resonates and still animates us today. Okay, so that's the overview. In the Enlightenment, basically evil is configured as a kind of faulty representation, that people are thinking not clearly, they're not using their instrument of reason. And it has basically a progressivist, amelioratory trajectory. You know, the famous Descartes called the cone of light, the natural light. And it's this metaphor of this cone, this light switch. It may be hard to get on in certain people, but once it's on, this cone goes out and takes in more and more people. And so it has this idea that in fact all ills can be remedied by the use of reason, by the increase of knowledge. It's a very progressivist, very optimist metaphor. And in the 19th century, there came a counter-rhetoric. And that was a rhetoric that configured evil not as a species of faulty representation to be ameliorated through education, but as a kind of infection. It was in the body. Later on it would be talked about as bad blood. Today we might talk about faulty genes, the famous gene for criminality or whatever. And what you've got to see, what is really important for us, is that has a totally different logic. If you think people are evil because they're thinking not clearly, because they have faulty representations, then we can correct that. But if you think it's in their blood, it's in their genes, it has a totally different logic. Then you're not worried about taking them in the cone of light. There is no cone of light. There's the world of darkness. And what you're worried about is not converting them, because you can't convert them. You're worried about becoming infected. And this became a very, very dominant, I'm not going to say it's a major metaphoric of the 19th century, but a very, very important voice in the 19th century. And this pathological fear of infection leads to the idea that, oh, those who are evil, they can't be rehabilitated. All we can do is to stop us, the normal people, the healthy people being infected, is that we can either isolate them or we can destroy them. And so it is a very pernicious and dangerous rhetoric. Okay. I need to get some presumptions on the board. Just started my timer. Okay. I'm operating with a Hegelian presumption. I can't go much into a lecture on Hegel for obvious reasons, but the meaning of our terms and our thoughts are determined by the inferential and historical relations. And I'll just go straight to the corollary, because that will help explain what the first one is. We do not have privileged, that is, we often say Cartesian, referring to Descartes, access to what our thoughts and words mean. Because Descartes is a paradigm thinker of the Enlightenment. You know, he would argue, oh, how do I know this hand really exists, etc. But one thing I do know is I know what's in my own head. I know my own thoughts. The world might be more or less inaccessible, but my own mind is perfectly transparent. That was one of the key Cartesian reference points that was taken up by the Enlightenment. But there's a series of thinkers, Hegel's very important, Schopenhauer's important, Nietzsche's important, Freud's important. They said, no, we don't have special access to our own mind. Freud and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer would stress the unconscious. What Hegel would stress in a more historicist vein is he said, look, you know what words you're going to say. I more or less know what my next sentence is going to be. That gives you access to the words you're saying. But what those words represent is not up to you. It's determined by their inferential connection, by how one term is connected, one thought is connected to another thought, and their historical resonances. So that's important. It's against the Cartesian idea. And that's why I go back to that Borges quote, that what really counts is the history of our metaphors. And those metaphors have a range beyond our conscious access. Okay? And that's why we get the second corollary. We need to do genealogy to make explicit the full meanings of our language and thoughts. And we're doing a bit of genealogy today. We're doing a genealogy of this rhetoric of degeneration. It's a rhetoric that's been lost to us in the 20th century because of the horrible things that happened, in the 21st century, but the horrible things that happened in the 20th century made this rhetoric totally unacceptable. But its metaphors are still there today, and I think they still animate us. And I'll say a little bit at the end about that. I also need to say, this is in the way of some groundwork introduction, I want to talk about two models of evil. And the model of evil that we'll be looking at mainly, which is animating this rhetoric of degeneration, is the Manichaean view. Mammon was a well, Christian Jewish prophet of the 3rd century AD, and actually he gives you the folkish view of Christianity. Christianity actually explicitly rejects this view, but I think it's the folkish, the core view of a lot of Christianity, that the world is permeated by two forces, good and evil, and he says they're equally strong. That's the part that's officially rejected. And the idea is there's evil that is evil in itself, pure evil. And so that evil needs to be isolated or destroyed. Against that is what I call the relational view. That's the view I think is actually taken up by the heroes of what would be the 20-week course. I can't really talk to you that much about them. Freud, Nietzsche, and Baudelaire, who actually are involved in this rhetoric of degeneration, but they try to turn it on their head in a way that I don't think was successful. The relational view says that evil isn't that you've got this pure substance evil and this pure substance good and they're in some kind of battle, but evil results from a misbalance by various forces. Like if you're Freudian, you'll think the one that would be configured as evil might be the feminine or the id, the one that might be configured as good might be the ego or the rational, and then Freud says, no, neither of them are good or evil in themselves. What they need, what happens is mental health, pathology comes from a, mental sickness, pathology comes from a misbalance between the ego and the id, or the rational and the feeling, or however one wants to put it. And what the notion of health involves not isolating or eliminating some element, but finding a certain kind of balance. Okay. Okay, I just want to acknowledge, because when I originally did this course, a lot of students reacted and said that surely there were pre-19th century biological notions of, for instance, gender. I'm going to, usually I talk about race, gender, and religion, but I'm just going to talk mainly about gender. It's the easiest one to talk about, and I can get a lot of famous authors in who you'll be familiar with, some of whom you won't be familiar with. But just to acknowledge that Aristotle already had a kind of a biological account of sexual difference. And these are lists taken up from Generation of Animal. Okay, so the male is obviously the good side, active, passive, form, matter. That becomes very, very important, form, matter. It's like the female is often identified merely with the body. Often it's said in the 19th century that women are governed, and we all heard this still in the 20th century, women are governed by their feelings, men are governed by their rationality. And you see that there, that's the distinction, form, matter. Man provides the form, the rationalism is in the category of form, not of matter. I won't go through the rest of them. Limited, unlimited, that's a bit hard for us to understand. But unlimited there sounds like, oh, infinite. But it's actually a negative quality from the metaphysics. Unlimited, it's like they've got no shape. And this is a betrayal a lot of women in this degeneration literature. It says women are shapeless, they assimilate to any environment, but that's meant to be in a negative way. It's like saying they don't have a soul, they don't have a definite character, etc. Odd, even, that's hard to explain. Right, left, or good, evil. Light, darkness, I think they're self-explanatory. I want to be super quick at this. And Aristotle used a Latin term to refer to a woman as a botched man. It's sometimes translated, there's a lot of fights about the translation, or monstrous animal. And his explanation of how females are created is, females come because there wasn't sufficient heat or movement in the act of generation. Hence, females are kind of botched men. That is, the ideal, the norm would be a male, but if something goes wrong, it's a female. Okay, so these are vital, and this is a great thinker, obviously, Aristotle, not on this topic, obviously. I just want to acknowledge that before the 19th century, there were already biological notions of gender difference. Okay, so now I want to talk about what I really want to talk about, 19th century biologism. Okay, Arthur Gobineau. He wrote this very famous book, very influential on the inequality of the races. And in fact, he's sometimes seen as the father of modern racism. I mean, to be fair to him, he kind of said each race had its strength. Now, we know he had his hierarchy of what the good races are. And his big shtick was that races shouldn't mix. So, you know, he had a big influence in the 19th century. What I really want to do, and I'm not going to read the whole quote, is to make you notice how much he uses medical forensic terms. See, when we're in the Enlightenment, we think of, as I said, we think of evil as representation, we think about people not thinking well, we think of faulty processes, but here it's all put on a medical, the terminology is already medical. He's talking about maladies, he's talking about diseases, remedy, poisonous, plague, ravages, fatal, suffering. I'll let you read the whole quote because I don't want to read the whole quote, it's particularly because of my time constraints. Okay. Now to get to one, oh, I missed a slide. Oh, no. Sorry, Benedict Morel. Benedict Morel was a psychiatrist, a physician, who wrote a very important book in French. I translated all the titles. Treatise on the intellectual and moral degeneration of the human species and the causes that produce these various maladies. And he's kind of one of the founding fathers. There are people before him, Blumenbach and others, who talk about degeneration. He is really the founding father of degeneration. He was dealing with mainly what he called cretins, what today we would call people with cerebral palsy. And he wanted to claim that they're somehow atavistic. They belong to an earlier time in the race, etc. And he was very worried about their possibilities interacting and infecting, actually. He thought it could be almost contagious, other members of society. But also, one of the funny things, and this goes throughout all the rhetoric of degeneration, there's this incredible fear of these so-called degenerates and how they might interact with us and contaminate us. At the same time, they're configured as less virile, as less healthy, as if their natural trajectory is to die out. And it's Freud would call it the logic of opposites. It's a strange combination that there's this almost pathological fear of these degenerates contaminating our society, as you'll come to see. And at the same time, it's saying that they're less virile, they're less fecund, they're less productive, and they just are naturally unhealthy, they're dying out. Well, if they're dying out, then why is there a worry? They never resolve this issue. Okay, Karl Vogt. Some of these people are people who've gone out of the canon. But Karl Vogt in his day, he's cited by Darwin, cited by absolutely everyone, was very, very well known, mainly through his book Lectures of Man. And he's also kind of I wouldn't say the founder, but he's the chief developer of the notion of chronology, that you could tell people's characters by reading their skulls. What we today would consider a paradigm of pseudoscience. But at his time, he was widely respected, cited by Darwin, we'll come to see. And already you see, what he did is he did these endless mathematical measurements of skulls in society, different races, of course, of different male, female, children, etc. I've got to say, his work was continued up in Yale. I found records of it up until the 1960s. People were still doing this kind of stuff, trying to read off from skull size characteristics. So here you see, I'll just read, some of them, the skulls of women are to be separated as if they belong to two different species, and they differ in their proportions more than many typical race skulls. By the way, we have a moderately clear notion of species. We normally say that two animals are of the same species if they can marry, if they can produce viable offspring. Actually, it doesn't work, that definition, but it's the one we often give incorrectly to our students, that's the best we can do. But anyhow, the point I want to make is in the 19th century, they were very, very confused about species, and often they would act, some people would write men and women came from different species, let alone, people from different races, etc. Okay, we can therefore say that the female skull approaches in many respects that of the infant, and is in still greater degree that of the lower races. So you see there's this classification of women, so-called lower races, obviously referring to mainly people from black races, and infants. Okay, in respect of morals, a woman is a conservative of old customs and uses of traditions, legends. She's not using her reason, she's just a repository of matter, so to speak, a hence of history. So in the material world, she preserves primitive forms, which slowly yield to the influence of civilization. Woman preserves in the formation of the head, the earliest stage in which the race or tribe has developed, or into which it has relapsed. And notice the notion of relapse. And this becomes, especially after Darwin, a key theme. Again, against the Enlightenment. Because the Enlightenment is this metaphor of the natural light, the cone of light going out and taking more and more in. But especially after Darwin, it's already started as early as Vogt, but after Darwin, actually the origins of species before this, the idea that man is just a series of humankind's development is just a series of accidents, and there's no natural trajectory of progress, we can just as easily regress and go backwards. You already see that when we talk about being relapses. Okay, then there's Haeckel. Haeckel was actually the main popularization of Darwin in Germany, and this is from the Evolution of Man. And this is a very, very famous sentence, the one it highlighted. Ontogeny is a recapitulation of phylogeny. It's called the recapitulation theory. And basically it says the development of the individual just mirrors the development of the species or the race or whatever term was appropriate. And varied in the way they put it. And so then this leads to this idea that, okay, individual develops as the race develops, but certain individuals can get stuck behind. That is, they can represent an earlier time of man's history. But it could also be just not that certain individuals, it could be a group of individuals. And often women was configured, as we've seen, I think already, as in some sense inherently atavistic. Okay. Now, look, Darwin is not a degenerationist. Darwin is obviously an out-and-out genius, so is Aristotle, and he has things to say, as we've seen. But it's important to see Darwin was not himself a degenerationist, because the degenerationists seem to be very, very pessimistic and have this kind of pathological fear of being infected by the inferior, the so-called inferior, I mean. And Darwin was basically an optimist. In some sense, Darwin belonged to the Enlightenment image. He really did think that we could better people's lots, including the lots of women, by giving them greater education. But there is these famous, I would call purple passages in Darwin's Descent of Man. And there are certain people, like his cousin Galton, who invented the word eugenics, who took these purple passages and took a lot more out of Darwin, obviously, going back to the origins of the species, and ran with it. Okay? So I'm going to read to you some of these purple passages, but I don't want you to go away thinking Darwin is just another one of these degenerationists. It's just that his work gave rise and gave great impetus to a lot of the work in degeneration theory, because after Darwin, this idea of progress really becomes questioned, and the idea of retrogression, that we could fall backwards, becomes a very, very strong and pronounced fear. And it's a fear, by the way, expressed not just by scientists like Darwin or pseudoscientists, we might call them like Vogt, but also it's very much expressed in literature. I'll talk a bit about, well, I won't talk about Baudelaire, I'll talk more about Zola, and also maybe I think I'll do some Dracula, Bram Stoker, Jekyll and Hyde, you see it in it. It becomes a very big theme in literature. It was in the newspapers. It's also in philosophy to a certain extent, people like Nietzsche. And also in psychology, but I won't have enough time to talk about that. Okay, so with Darwin. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a bigger state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone at the last moment. Okay. Thus, weak members of civilized society propagate their kind. No one, this is a really famous passage, no one has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care or a care wrongly directed leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. Now I have to say, there's differences in the context of English degeneration theory, Italian generation theory, and German and French degeneration theory. And what's very particular about the English thing is there's a certain kind of class awareness going on. Because England was, industrializing, got there first, often and early. England was the industrial nation par excellence. And a lot of middle-class people, for the first time in these big cities, were seeing this conglomeration of the poor. And they had this kind of incredible fear. You see it even expressed in, as I say, progressive Enlightenment people like Mill, John Stuart Mill, or the ignorant, the working class, are breeding like flies, would be the metaphor, and they're going to swamp us. And Darwin has some of this. This is less true of the German context than the Italian and the French context, because they were not so heavily industrialized. A bit more from Darwin. Okay, degraded members breed early and often. And he refers to Galton, his cousin, who, as I said, invented the modern eugenic theory. I'll just skip to the bottom part. Thus, no one's to take offence at many offensive things that will be said in this lecture. But I'm just quoting, I'm not endorsing. Thus, the reckless, degraded, and often vicious members of society tend to increase at a quicker rate than the provident and generally virtuous members. Or, as Mr. Gregg puts the case, the careless, squalid, uninspiring Irishman multiplies like rabbits, there you see the metaphor. The frugal, foreseeing, self-respecting, ambitious Scot, stern in his morality, spiritual in his faith, sagacious and disciplined in his intelligence, passes his best years in the struggle and in early celibacy, marries late and leaves fewer behind. This we can laugh at, there's some stuff that, you just look down at. But yeah, so you can see the fear here. This is the fear of the worst breeding and swamping. Okay. And then Darwin says, this is me speaking, inferiors may swamp the populace leading to regression. If various checks do not prevent the reckless, the vicious, and otherwise inferior members of society from increasing at a quicker rate than the better class of men, the nation will retrograde, as has still often occurred in the history of the world. We must remember that progress is no invariable rule. Very important. And now you see him saying stuff similar to both. It's not his pronounced voice, but he definitely says it. Male and female children resemble each other closely, like the young of so many other animals, in which the adult sexes differ widely. They likewise resemble the mature female much more closely than the mature male. The female, however, ultimately assumes certain distinctive characteristics, and the formation of her skull is said to be intermediate between the child and the male. Okay, so that's more of this rhetoric, and the reference to skull, he actually refers to people like Vogt and Beckler in his book, and he actually says of some I think it was actually there's a dissenter man, he said, I wouldn't have written this book had I had Vogt's full text and Hegel's text earlier. Okay, the woman is atavistic, woman has traits characteristic of the lower races and of a past lower state. It is generally admitted that with women, the powers of intuition, of rapid perception, perhaps of imitation, women are configured as animals, basically, are more strongly marked than in man. But some, at least, of these faculties are characteristic of the lower races and therefore of a past and lower state of civilization. Okay. But I'm dealing with women because it's easy to deal with the race than the race stuff. But the race stuff, is horrible, remains horrible, and has had horrible consequences. Luckily, the woman issue has been settled the other way for us. Okay. I'm introducing you to a lot of text in this lecture, I have to say. Okay, Lombroso and Ferraro. Lombroso is actually he was a liberal lefty, in fact. But he's famous is the founder of modern craniology. And his work was very important in revising how the 19th century configured their prisons and how they dealt with criminals. But he had this notion of the born criminal, because he thought the criminal is not a matter of environment, not a matter of education, but, well, he would have said it's in their blood. And he thought he traced criminal families. There was a big literature of this beyond Lombroso, especially after Lombroso. A lot of it was done in America, tracing criminal families, and the criminality is something that's passed on from generation to generation. But he wrote this famous book, The Male Offender, also with Ferraro. That was about 3 decades earlier, I think, in the 1860s. But I want to look at the Female Offender from 1893. Both books were extremely influential. Okay, the primitive type of the species is more clearly represented in the female. We saw that women have many traits in common with children. This is a common thematic, that somehow women, as I said, remember what Aristotle said, it's almost women are botched males, not enough generative heat, they haven't fully developed. Well, women are treated in this literature in a similar way. They haven't fully developed to the male heights of being animals, not animals, going beyond their animality to a world of enlightened reason, you might say. We saw that women have many traits in common with children, that their moral sense is deficient, they are revengeful, jealous, inclined to vengeance, and glorify cruelty. When the morbid activity of the physical centers intensifies the bad quality of women, induces them to seek relief in evil deeds, blah, blah, blah. It's clear that the innocuous semi-criminal present in a normal woman must be transformed into a born criminal, more terrible than any man. But what's really weird about this rhetoric is this rhetoric of the inherent criminality of women, because they're not ruled by reason, they're ruled by their sentiment, they're ruled by their bodies, they are their bodies, is, as a matter of fact, of course, nearly all the crimes are committed by men. What terrific criminals would be children. So children which we might like to think of as inherently innocent, are now seen as inherently guilty because they've got their animal nature. They are victims only of their animal nature. They haven't got that enlightened faculty of reason yet. What terrific criminals would children be if they had strong passions, muscular strength, and sufficient intelligence, if moreover their evil tendencies were exasperated by morbid physical activity. And women are big children, blah, blah, blah. I sometimes get sick of reading all of this stuff. But you see the problem. These semi-criminals with evil tendencies commit exponentially fewer crimes than men. But this is due again to their atavism. Okay? So women are essentially atavistic. That's why they are more inclined to criminality by their nature. But because they're atavistic, they don't get to commit crimes as much as men because they're more sedentary in a certain way. Yet another reason for the comparative rarity of the criminal type in women is that congenitally they are less inclined to crime than men. Atavism must be held to account for this fact. Yeah. It's a very confused rhetoric, but it's still a very important and very strong rhetoric. Okay. Lombroso, I like this one, from Atavism and Evolution. That was actually published under that title in an English journal first, not an Italian one. It is a prevalent delusion of our time that we are progressing. You know, we picture ourselves as an endless line leading straight up to heaven without any turning to imagining our own white race at the top of the line, attaining by a continuous rise to measurable heights of civilization. Okay. So he says, backward movements, just as in the case of individuals, are met with a point of recurrence and atavism. So it's this, again, this post-Darwinian fear, I might say, put it that way, that we can very easily go backwards. Okay. Here, I want to talk about a bit about how this is inflected in literature. Emile Zola wrote these series of books from 1871 to 1903, the Rougon-Macquart series of books. And Zola was very strange. He had this form of literature which he called a realism, naturalism sometimes, but mainly realism. And what Zola thought was, he is making these scientific theories of people like Lombroso and Vogt and Darwin, to a lesser extent, he was less familiar with Darwin, available to the popular masses. And he wrote these popular books. I think they're all pretty awful myself, but he almost felt like he was doing empirical inquiry, which is strange. There's nothing empirical about it because these are just totally made up stories. But he nevertheless thought he was continuing on a certain kind of vein of natural science. Very confused idea. But what is important is that he spread these ideas of degeneration, because what the 20-volume series of novels does is it traces a family. It starts with an aristocratic family where, I forgot the name of the matriarch of the family. She's married to a rich businessman, but she has something a bit wrong with her. A slight scene of cretinism, we might say. And she also has an affair with some blackguard criminal. And then it traces the two lines of children that develop from the two different husbands. And Nana, a famous courtesan or prostitute, is a key figure in this. So I wanted, and Nana is configured as an infection. Of course, by the way, a lot of this is tied with middle-class worries about syphilis. Because a lot of men were seeing prostitutes, and sex in those days could be very, very dangerous with the syphilis and couldn't be treated. So there's that in the background. Okay. So at one point she's with Rufa and Fauchereau, two of her lovers. Well, one's a non-lover, but she's endlessly dangling him. And he's reading this article called The Golden Fly, describes the life of a harlot. It's obviously meant to be referring to Nana, the courtesan, descended from 4 or 5 generations of drunkards and taken in the blood by a cumulative inheritance of misery and drink, which in her case had taken the form of a nervous exaggeration of the sexual instinct. She avenges the beggars and outcasts of whom she is the ultimate product. With her rottenness that is allowed to ferment among the populace, is carried upward and rocks the aristocracy. She becomes a blind power of nature, a legion of destruction. Unwittingly, she corrupts and disorganizes all Paris. A fly which sucks the death on the carrion, tolerated by the roadside, and then buzzing, dancing, and glittering like a precious stone, enters the window of the palace and poisons the men within by merely setting on them in her fly. So you're going to get this metaphorical poisoning, contamination of the aristocracy by the lower classes, and what's really important here is no sense of intent. She doesn't intend, a fly doesn't intend to hurt anyone. A fly does hurt people with its spreading of germs, and that's how Nana is. Nana is like a beast who's got no intentionality, but she's just a repository of this kind of illness. She's a blind power of nature. So it's this medical, epidemiological problem as opposed to a moral, legal problem. Okay, one more part from Nana. Looking at her, she frightened him, blah, blah, blah. She had corrupted his life. He had already felt himself tainted to his very marrow by impurity, hitherto dreamed of. Everything was now destined to rot within him, and in a twinkling of an eye, he understood that what this evil entailed. He saw the ruin brought about by this kind of leaven, himself poisoned, his family destroyed, a bit of social fabric cracking and crumbling. So this passage has all these kind of medical metaphoric of infection, referring to marrows, impurities, tainted, poison, but it does use one moral term, evil, which really shouldn't be an appropriate term, because that belongs to the old world, either the Enlightenment version or the religious version. I have much to say about the religious version of evil, not having time. But in an animal, in some sense, she's beyond the moral. But he can't help slipping into moral language. And as I say, degeneration literature is typically conflicted and confused on this point, officially opting for a non-moralized forensic medical outlook. It often slipping back into the old moral, even biblical moral language. And just, for instance, Lombroso, when he talked about criminals, one of the things he actually stressed in his book in the male offenders is we should stop talking about criminals in moral terms. We should stop, he actually said we should not talk about them as evil. They are sick, was his view, or they are degenerate. And that might sound positive to us, but the actual logic of it is not very positive. Because he said they're sick in a sense of a contamination, and they're sick in a way that they can't be cured. So his view was they have to be isolated. Yes, he did say we shouldn't moralize criminality, but what he did say is they need to be isolated. Okay, reading on. Okay, Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, I'll come back in the end to say something about Nietzsche. Nietzsche participated in the rhetoric of degeneration. In fact, in his famous book, The Genealogy of Morals, he kind of configures the Jew as a certain kind of infection. Of course, he's playing with the German audience because he's telling the German audience, the Jews infected you. In fact, you are their sickness because you are Christian. Because he saw Christianity as a Jewish sickness invented to subvert the Roman Empire. It's a long story which I can't get into here. But this is a typical passage. These are one of these very nasty passages in Nietzsche. The disease of man's great danger, not the evil, not the beast of prey. Those who from the outset have failed, downcast, broken. They are the ones, the weakest, are the ones who most undermine life among humans, and most dangerously poison medical forensic metaphors, and call into question our confidence in life. That the sick not make the healthy sick. This would be such a softening. That should certainly be the highest viewpoint on earth. But this would require, above all else, the healthy remain separated from the sick. So there, and it's not Nietzsche's normal voice, I'll come on to that later, but there you see in the full degenerationist mode. And if there are these sick people, and they represent a threat and a contamination to us. Okay. Okay. This book by Max Nordau, Degeneration, events in the 20th century made sure that this rhetoric of degeneration has become lost to us and we don't hear about it anymore. But this book also helped. Max Nordau wrote this book, Degeneration, and a lot of it is just endless quotation of people like, who's on his list? Wagner's on his list, Ibsen's on his list, Zola's on his list, Nietzsche's on his list, and he said they're all degenerate. And he just quotes large slabs out of them and says, look, these guys are completely insane, obviously, and that's about the level of his commentary. So his book actually started hurting the theory of degeneration. But I wanted to quote him because he's very famous for this book. Whoever believes with me that society is a natural organic form of humanity in which alone it can exist, prosper and continue to develop itself to higher destinies, whoever looks upon civilization as a good, having value and deserving to be defended, must mercilessly crush under his thumb the antisocial vermin. To him, who with Nietzsche is enthusiastic over the free-roving, lusting beasts of prey, we cry, get you gone from civilization, rove far for us. Be a lusting beast of prey in the desert, satisfy yourself. There is no place among us for the lusting beast of prey, and if you dare to return to us, we will pitifully beat you to death with clubs. Actually, I'm missing the commentary there. Oh, I got it again here. Okay, so there are two possibilities for same quotation. There are two possibilities canvassed here by Nordau for degeneration. One is isolation, rove far from us in the desert, away from civilization, or extermination. We will pitilessly beat you to death with clubs. Okay, again, how is this inflected in literature? A very good case is Dracula. Okay, Dracula, Bram Stoker, when he originally started writing Dracula, wanted to be a gothic horror story. But meanwhile, he'd been actually reading people like Vogt and Lombroso, and it's actually a story about warning. It's a warning story about the degenerates who are coming amongst us. That is to be empiric. The criminal always works at one crime. The criminal is not the full man brain. He's out of this. He is clever and cunning and resourceful, but he is not of stature as to brain. He be of a child brain. We've seen that before in much. Now the criminal of ours is predestined to crime also, straight Lombroso. He too have child brain and is of the child to do what he has done. Sorry, they're just quoting straight from it. The little bird, the little fish, the animal, sorry, that should be learned, that's my misprint. Not by principle, but empirically. The Count, meaning Count Dracula, is a criminal and of a criminal type. Nor do Lombroso would so classify. In qua criminal, he is of imperfectly formed mind. He was Van Helsing saying this, and famous vampire hunter. I can't go into this here in the course. I give two whole lectures on this, but arguably, and there's been a lot of work done on this in secondary literature, that is clearly Jewish Semitic to his audience. He abhors the cross, he has a need of blood of others. It's the famous Christian saw against the Jews that they need Christian blood. He's a parasite, he's a wanderer without fixed land, but he's also feminine. Again, I can't make the case he's perverted, sorry, that's how the feminine was considered in this literature. He's associated with foul smells, he hoards gold, he's a shapeshifter. The Jew blends in with his host. So that's very, very collapsed. But as I say, I can't make the case here, but Dracula was seen as this foreign, Eastern, strange, Semitic, feminine figure. And what is he doing? He's coming here and he's corrupting good English girls, famously. You know, there's Lucy and there's Mina. Mina's the one who survives. Lucy's the one who's infected and becomes a vampire. And it's a story about protecting our women from these nefarious Eastern influences. Okay? So it's very much within the orbit and gambit of degeneration theory. And Dracula, Stoker saw it that way. Okay. I've got Otto Weininger. And so I've got to say there's a certain kind of there's a certain kind of fantasy here. As I say, the degenerate is something sick, it's an infection, it's something that needs to be, by logic, isolated or eliminated. But you can't really, you would think, have this, when it's configured in races, you can see how that could go. When it's configured in terms of Jews, you can see how that could go, and you can see how it did go in a certain way. When it's configured with women, well, what exactly is the solution here? Is there thing as degenerate? Well, Weininger, and Weininger in his day, that book, Sex and Character, was more read than Freud, was extremely influential. He had a solution, but we'll come to that. So he claimed, he actually turned the male and female into psychological types. So he goes a bit away from the normal physiological-based metaphoric of degeneration. And some scholars actually want to say he's not really a degenerationist. But I think it's very closely related. He said for each one of us, we've got a certain amount of male and female. But the point is the male is configured as the positive, as the rational, and the female is configured as the material, the bodily, the sensual, the element of desire. So he said each of us is an equation for us. How much? He said there are no actual pure males and there are no pure females. There's males and females as comes in degree. So he popularized the idea of the fundamental bisexuality of all life forms. Living beings, is a quote from him, living beings cannot be described as bluntly as one sex or the other. Freud was very influenced by Weininger, especially on this notion of the fundamental bisexuality of all humans, and described Weininger as brilliant but sexually deranged. And he quotes Aristotle that procreation of male principle is the formative active one, the agent, the logos, while the female is the passive material. Okay. Now, what Weininger did is he put together Jews and women. He was, by the way, he was a Jew. He converted to Catholicism. In some sense, you can see his fear was that one day he'd wake up in the morning and find himself a Jewish woman. And there's work done on that is suppressed homosexuality. I think that should be taken with a grain of salt. But he makes this congruity. And actually, in the long version of this course, I do a lot of how the rhetoric of degeneration is applied to Jews. I stuck with women because, the Jew stuff is just so offensive that it's easy to stick with the women stuff at the moment. But he makes this, the congruity between Jews and women further reveals itself in the extreme adaptability of the Jew. Have no shape, remember? Going back to Aristotle. Adaptability of the Jews in their great talent for journalism and the mobility of their minds, that's in inverted commas, their lack of deeply rooted and original ideas. There's a big rhetoric in this 19th century anti-Semitism that the Jews are degenerate and can't be originary. They can take an idea someone else has had and develop it, but they can't do their own idea. Why? Because they don't have a native soil. Ideas come from the native soil. It's part of the Gluten-Bodily rhetoric of the Germans in particular. That because they are nothing in themselves, like women, they're nothing in themselves, they can become everything, hence unlimited. The Jew is an individual, not an individuality. It's a constant close relation with the lower life and has no share in the higher metaphysical life. Women and Jews have shapeshifted. The woman is material which passively assumes any form impressed upon it. In the Jew there is a definite aggressiveness. It's not because of the great impression that others make on him that he is receptive. He is no more subject to the suggestions of the Aryan man, but he adapts himself to every circumstance. Again, he's a shapeshifter in every race, becoming like the parasite, a new creature in every different host, although remaining essentially the same. So Weininger's solution to the Jewish woman problem, as he saw it, is we should stop breeding. And then in one generation, there'll be no more Jews and no more women. But men will continue, because he thought souls, pure souls, are actually a male existence. I know, this is totally nutty, but I want what you think. At the time, he was very, very rare. Okay. How am I going to correct? Oh, I have to slow down. Later manifestation. I think some of you can see where some of this is going. I don't want to say that degeneration theory had to lead to the events of the of 39 to 45, and particularly the Holocaust. I don't want to say it was inevitable. What I want to say is it's an enabling condition. Right? It opens up a range of possibilities. But what this rhetoric of degeneration did is it allowed us to think in certain ways. It provided us with a certain language, a certain set of metaphors. And often the way I construct the class is at the end of the class, in the very last week, I give the students just a couple of pages from Mein Kampf. And what I want them to see is I want to see there is absolutely nothing originally. Mein Kampf is a book that Hitler wrote in prison in 1923. There's nothing original there. He's just taken a series of metaphors and he's literalized them. But the metaphors are not new. So I'll give you a little passage. He, the Jew, is and remains the eternal parasite, a sponger, who like a pernicious bacillus spreads over wider and wider areas according to some favourable area attracts him. Okay, so remember going back to Gobenau originally in 1883, he used terms like maladies, disease, poison and plague. And here Hitler is using similar terms of bacillus, parasite, so it's configured in this forensic medical rhetoric. But the thing is, with people like Gobenau, it was always hovered between the metaphorical and the literal. Whereas what Hitler does is just literalizes those metaphors. He says, yes, they are a parasite. Such and such people are a parasite, are a disease. You can't educate a parasite. All you can do is isolate or eliminate. We'll know which option he took. Okay? So these metaphors are very, very dangerous metaphors. And this 19th century rhetoric of degeneration was an enabling condition. As I say, I'm not saying an inevitable trajectory. I'm saying a certain rhetoric enables and opens up certain possibilities. So if you're a Kantian, what you think is each of us as humans have this faculty of reason. Each of us as humans, because we have the faculty of reason, even if we don't use it, even if we're stubborn, we talk about certain people. We actually talk about Jews and women as being people who, some groups who tend not to use their reason. But what Kant's main message was is that we as humans all have the faculty of reason, and as of the faculty of reason, we are members of what he called the kingdom of ends, and hence worthy of respect. Yesterday was touched upon about whether Kant was a racist. We could also, in the anthropology, the pragmatic point of view, of a racist thing. He was also a bit of a misogynist. But that's irrelevant. The point is, what is the trajectory of Kant's ideas? And the trajectory of Kant's ideas is great emancipatory. After Kant, in the 19th century, there were a whole series of jurists, especially in Germany, who were Kantians or neo-Kantians, and they were moved by this Kantian sentiment that all humans have the faculty of reason and are worthy of respect. So they wanted to increase the enfranchisement. Like in a lot of the 19th century German principalities, that for instance, started giving enfranchisement, both political and economic, to Jews, did it because they were influenced by Kantian ideals. And later on, a whole string of German feminists were basically of a Kantian variety. Think of the English feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. She runs the Kantian line. She said, we as humans are endowed with the faculty of reason. Women have not been able to use their reason because they're being miseducated, because they're being persecuted and subjugated in various ways. But they have that, and if we educate them, they will use their reason. So as I said, you can see that as emancipated. Whether Kant himself was a racist or a misogynist doesn't matter. His rhetoric and his trajectory of his thought is emancipatory. But the rhetoric and the trajectory of this degeneration thought, the possibilities that it opens up are quite counter. Okay. And so the last thing I want to mention very briefly is, before I say the good side, I've got time, I've got 4 minutes. I think we should consider how we in the West now have come to stigmatize Islam. So it's not just about the past, it's about the present. And I've read tons of texts. I haven't talked about America, about how Americans, for instance, stigmatized the Easterners who were coming from the pogroms that were in the Ukraine and Russia. A lot of them were Jewish people, all different kinds of people coming from the east of Europe. They were stigmatized in many of the ways that Islam is stigmatized today, as being different from us, as not of the West, as being foreign, as having different habits, etc. Same story, we're getting it all over again. We're being primed in certain ways. Okay, that's my little political spiel. But I think there's a lot of this continuation of this degenerationist metaphoric, as they can't be part of our society, being recapitulated now against Islam. Okay, I want to talk very briefly, I've got 3 more minutes, of the alternative relational view of evil. Freud, by the way, has what we call a projective theory. Freud actually thinks a lot of this stigmatizing of foreigners is actually a projection of parts of ourselves. I can't say too much about this. But Freud thinks there's a kind of a foreign voice within us. He calls it the id, that is the world of desire, which is separate from our rationality and consciousness, about the enlightenment value. And we feel that as a threat. And because it's such a threat within, which we can't handle, we project it out and we say, oh, those are the foreigners, not us. So he thinks a lot of our hatred or fear of foreigners is actually a projection of elements of ourselves. But Freud himself thought he's actually implicated in degeneration theory in ways I won't have time to talk to. Maybe you can ask me a question about that. But he thought himself as actually rejecting degeneration theory. In a way, he's right. Because what he wants to say is he wants to say the sick, for instance, the hysteric, is not different from us in kind. In degeneration theory says the degenerate is atavistic, is different from us in kind. It's almost a different species. What Freud said is the hysteric is like you, only more so. That is, he wanted to use the hysteric to read in, to talk to us about us so-called healthy, normal people. But here you can see, this is the projective theory. Nothing foreign is entered into you. A part of your own mind is withdrawn from your knowledge, that's the id, and command of your will. That is why you are so weak in defending yourself. And at the top you'll see he talks about what other people have said: degeneration, hereditary disposition, constitutional inferiority. Psychoanalysts, on the other hand, undertake to throw light on these uncanny disturbances. So Freud sees himself as rejecting degeneration theory. I put this up, one, to make that point, but I think he's implicated in it in a certain way, especially what he says about women, but I can't go into that here, but also to say that he's got this projective theory, which I think is interesting. And the last thing I want to talk about, Nietzsche. And I think this is Nietzsche's predominant voice. We saw that voice when Nietzsche said, oh, the sick need to be isolated before they make the healthy sick. But Nietzsche's view is actually, look, if you're weak, you can't take on the sick. You'll just be infected by them in a negative way. But he thinks his kind of person, the genuinely strong person, is actually made better by infection. And he has this very famous passage in Human All Too Human, ennoblement through degeneration. Written in the 1870s, his audience would have been shocked. What do you mean ennoblement through degeneration? There's nothing noble about being a degenerate. This is Nietzsche switching the tables. History teaches that